A grieving duke bought an orphan to be his wife, but what happened that night changed everything. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. It was a cold winter evening when the Duke of Ravenshill, a man consumed by grief and loss, made a decision that would change his life forever. The Duke had been in mourning for years after the tragic death of his wife, a loss that had left him hollow and distant from the world. His days were filled with business, and his nights spent in the empty halls of his grand estate, the silence only broken by the occasional footsteps of servants who came and went like shadows. In a desperate attempt to fill the void, the Duke made a choice that many would consider outrageous. He bought an orphan, a young girl with nothing left to her name, and promised her a life of security, though at the cost of her freedom. Her name was Eleanor, and though she was grateful for the shelter, the wealth, and the protection, there was a heaviness in her heart. She knew that her life had been bought, and the price she had paid was the loss of her choices, her voice, her future. On the night she arrived at Ravenshill Manor, a storm raged outside, the wind howling through the trees, the thunder cracking through the heavens, as if the very earth mourned with her. As she stepped out of the carriage, she felt a shiver run through her, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming sense of being trapped. The Duke's gaze was cold and distant as he led her into the mansion, his presence as imposing as the storm outside. But as they stood in the grand entrance hall, something changed. His eyes, once filled with nothing but sorrow, flickered with something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. Little did she know, that very night, everything would change. The Duke, whose heart had been locked away for so long, found himself drawn to her in a way he never expected. Eleanor, the orphan he had bought, had a strength that he hadn't anticipated. Despite her situation, she carried herself with a quiet dignity, an unspoken defiance that unsettled him in ways he couldn't understand. That night, as they sat down to their first meal together, an unexpected tension filled the air. The Duke, though still distant, could not tear his eyes away from her. She, in turn, found herself strangely comforted by his presence, despite the coldness that surrounded him. As the storm raged outside, a different kind of storm began to stir within them both, one neither could predict. But what happened that night would forever alter the course of their lives, and it all began with a single, unspoken connection between them. The night was far from over, and the storm outside was just the beginning. The night had fallen heavier now, and the storm outside continued to rage, swirling against the towering windows of Ravenshill Manor. Eleanor sat alone in the large dining hall, the candlelight flickering in her eyes as she stared at her reflection in the polished surface of the table. She was no longer just the orphan girl from the streets, no longer just a nameless face bought by the Duke. No, tonight something had shifted. The Duke of Ravenshill, a man who had been broken by grief, had looked at her differently, and for the first time, she felt something stir within her. It was not love, she couldn't call it that, but there was something, an understanding, a quiet recognition. A man who had been consumed by loss and solitude had found something in her, something he had not expected. His gaze, once distant, had softened for just a moment, as if he saw beyond the formality of their arrangement, beyond the walls he had so carefully built around himself. Eleanor's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. The Duke appeared at the door, his silhouette dark against the flickering light from the hallway. His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her heart race. He hesitated before stepping forward, his movements deliberate, cautious. "You're still awake," he said, his voice low and controlled, though there was an underlying tension to it, an unspoken question. Eleanor nodded, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice steady, though she could feel the unease settling deep in her chest. The Duke watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow breath, he walked toward the hearth and stood with his back to her, his gaze fixed on the dying fire. The room was filled with the crackling of the embers, and for a long while, neither spoke. Eleanor's mind raced. She knew why she was here. She knew what was expected of her. But what if it was more than just a contract? What if the Duke didn't just see her as a means to an end, as a solution to his loneliness, but as something more? She didn't know. Her heart wanted to believe it, but her mind warned her not to. She had learned long ago that hope was a dangerous thing. The Duke's voice broke the silence. "I never thought I would be in this position," he said softly, as if speaking more to himself than to her. To be forced to marry again, to take someone in for the sake of duty. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. What could she say? She wasn't a fool. She knew why he had married her, just as she knew the coldness with which he had treated her. But there had been something tonight, a glimmer in his eyes, a shift in his presence. "And what of you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you think of this marriage?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He turned to look at her, his expression momentarily faltering before he regained his composure. He stepped closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "I think," he said slowly, "that this was never the life I imagined for myself. But perhaps there is more to it than I thought. Perhaps this is not just about duty." His gaze dropped for a moment, as if he were searching for the right words. "Perhaps there is something between us that could grow, something we never expected." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time that night, she felt a flicker of hope. But she couldn't allow herself to believe it. She had lived with enough pain to know that such things were fleeting. And yet, the way he looked at her, the way his voice trembled with emotion, it was unlike anything she had ever seen. "I don't expect you to love me," he continued, his voice more certain now. "But I do want to try. I want to try to understand you, to understand what this partnership could be." Eleanor met his gaze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she thought she saw something vulnerable in his eyes, something human. But just as quickly, it was gone. He stepped back, his posture stiffening once again. "We will take this slowly," he said, his tone returning to its usual detached self. "There is no need for us to rush. For now, let us simply exist together." The words were not promises, not declarations of love. But for Eleanor, they were enough. Enough to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, this cold, grieving Duke was capable of more than just obligation. She wasn't sure where it would lead, or what would come of their strange union. But for the first time, she felt a spark of possibility. And that, in itself, was more than she had ever dared hope for. Days passed, and though the storm outside had subsided, the tension inside Raven's Hill Manor lingered, thick in the air like the damp cold that refused to leave the stone walls. Eleanor spent her mornings walking the expansive grounds of the estate, her mind constantly racing with the weight of her new reality. She was no longer a nameless orphan, but the wife of a grieving Duke, though the title felt empty, hollow even, without the warmth she had hoped would come with it. The Duke, for his part, seemed as distant as ever. He kept to his study for hours each day, emerging only for formal dinners and the occasional passing glance at her. It was as if he were a ghost, haunting the mansion in the same way the memories of his lost wife seemed to haunt him. Eleanor couldn't help but wonder if there was any room left in his heart for her. She had hoped, on that fateful night when their eyes had met, that there might be a spark, a flicker of something more than duty between them. But the days that followed left her with nothing but a deepening sense of isolation. The only real connection they seemed to share was the silence between them. That is, until one evening, when everything changed. It was late when Eleanor returned to the manor after a long walk, her steps slow as she approached the front doors, the crisp evening air still fresh in her lungs. As she entered, she noticed the faint glow of light spilling out from the study. The Duke was still awake, a rare occurrence these days. Hesitant but curious, she made her way toward the study, where she found him, not behind his desk as she expected, but sitting by the fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring into the flames. He didn't notice her at first, lost in his thoughts. Eleanor took a quiet step forward, her heart beating a little faster in her chest. "Your Grace," she said softly, unsure of the reception she would receive. The Duke's gaze snapped to her, his expression unreadable, though there was something in his eyes, something that softened for the briefest moment, as though he had forgotten to hide it. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low, almost reluctant, as if speaking her name took more effort than he cared to admit. "I didn't expect you to still be awake." She stood still in the doorway, unsure of how to proceed, her hands clasped nervously before her. I couldn't sleep, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. The Duke studied her for a long moment, his brow furrowing as though debating something within himself. Finally, he stood and walked toward her, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. He stopped just a few feet away from her, his gaze intense, though not unkind. I know this hasn't been easy for you, he said, the words heavy with a sincerity she hadn't expected. I haven't been the husband I should have been, and for that, I am sorry. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing. Was he truly apologizing? For what? For their arrangement? For his coldness? She couldn't be sure. But there was something about the way he spoke, something raw, something vulnerable that she hadn't seen before. I understand, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't expect anything more. He looked at her for a moment longer, his eyes searching hers as if looking for something, though he didn't seem to find it. Then, in a surprising move, he reached out, his hand hovering near hers, though he didn't touch her. I think we both need to try harder, he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. I'll try. For you. For us. The words hung in the air, a promise, fragile, uncertain, but genuine. Eleanor didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure if she could trust it, if she could believe him, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this wouldn't be the life she had feared. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to their union than duty and obligation. The Duke gave her one last, lingering look before turning back toward the fire. Get some rest, he said, his tone softer now. We have a long road ahead of us. Eleanor nodded, her heart heavy, yet strangely light at the same time. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she didn't feel completely alone. As she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were finally starting to change, that the storm inside Ravenshill Manor, much like the storm outside, had finally begun to pass. It's been weeks since the night the Duke had spoken those words, since he had finally allowed a crack in the walls he had built around himself, and Eleanor had begun to feel something stir in her own heart. Though the house still felt cold, still wrapped in the remnants of grief, something was slowly changing. The Duke had kept his word, or at least, he tried. He no longer ignored her, no longer treated her as if she were merely an obligation to be endured. They began to share meals together, conversations that had once been stilted and awkward now flowing more naturally, though neither of them dared to cross certain boundaries. Eleanor had started to feel a sense of belonging, something she never thought she would experience in such a place, with such a man. Yet despite the growing connection, there were still days when the distance between them felt insurmountable. The Duke had his moments when his past would come rushing back, and his coldness would settle over him like a thick fog. Those were the times when Eleanor would retreat into the quiet corners of the manor, lost in her thoughts, unsure of how to reach him. It was on one of these days that the storm within him became impossible to ignore. It had started with a simple, seemingly innocent question. Eleanor had asked him about his late wife, about the woman he had once loved so deeply, the woman whose memory still haunted every corner of Ravenshill. The Duke had been unusually quiet that evening, staring into the fire, the orange glow dancing across his face. He had seemed lost in thought, as if he were battling some internal war. You don't need to ask about her, he had said, his voice hoarse, as though the words were ripped from him. She's gone, Eleanor. There is nothing left to say. Eleanor had hesitated. She knew the pain of losing someone you loved, the pain of feeling as though part of you had died along with them. But she also knew that silence would not bring them closer. I understand, she had said softly, not wanting to push him further, yet feeling a deep ache in her chest as she spoke. But I want to understand you, the real you. Not just the Duke, not just the man you've become. The Duke had not responded right away, but after a long, agonizing silence, he had turned to face her. His eyes were dark, filled with years of grief, but there was something else in them too, something raw, something unspoken. You think you can understand me? He had asked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. I'm a man broken by loss, Eleanor. There's nothing left to understand. Eleanor had reached out instinctively, her hand hovering near his, but she stopped herself. She wasn't sure if he wanted her comfort, or if he even needed it. I believe there is always something left, she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with compassion. Even in the darkest parts of us, there is always something left to find. The Duke had looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime, he had leaned back, his hand falling to his side. "Perhaps you are right," he had said softly. "But I don't know if I can ever truly let go of what I lost." Eleanor's heart ached for him. She understood the pain of loss, of carrying it with you for so long that it became a part of you, a shadow that never left. But she also knew that healing didn't come from holding on to the past. It came from accepting it and learning to live alongside it. "I'm not asking you to forget," she said, her voice soft yet resolute. "But maybe, together, we can find a way to live again." The Duke had remained silent, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire. The words hung in the air, neither of them knowing what would come next. But for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt as though they were on the verge of something fragile, but something worth fighting for. The next few days passed in a strange, uncertain calm. The Duke seemed to withdraw into himself again, though not as deeply as before, and Eleanor found herself caught in a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She had never imagined that a man like him could be so conflicted, so torn between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. And though the storm inside him still raged from time to time, Eleanor couldn't help but feel that there was something more beneath the surface, something that might one day make them both whole again. Then, on a quiet afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, something happened. Eleanor was sitting in the library, reading through a book of poetry she had found hidden away in the Manor's extensive collection, when she heard the soft creak of the door opening. She looked up to find the Duke standing in the doorway, his posture more relaxed than she had seen in weeks. "Eleanor," he said, his voice steady, though there was a hint of something different in it. "There's something I need to tell you." The moment hung in the air, heavy with anticipation. Eleanor set the book aside, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what he was about to say, but she knew that this moment would change everything between them. "I am not the man I once was, Eleanor." The Duke's voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes that revealed the depth of his struggle, something raw and unspoken. He stepped closer to her, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if he were searching for the right words. Eleanor's heart ached as she watched him. She had seen this side of him before, the side that carried the weight of grief like a heavy cloak. But this time it felt different. He wasn't hiding behind his distance. He wasn't retreating into the cold walls he had built around himself. There was vulnerability in him now, a quiet longing that mirrored her own. "I thought I could keep going like this forever, alone, lost in my sorrow," he continued, his voice tinged with regret. "But I realize now that I've been running from something that I shouldn't have. From you." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to open up like this. She knew the pain he carried, but to hear him admit it so openly, to see him struggling with it, it was both heartbreaking and beautiful. She stood, unable to speak for a moment, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had always known that there was more to him than the cold, distant Duke. She had always felt the man beneath the layers of grief and duty, but to have him admit it, to have him admit that he was willing to try again, to be with her, was more than she had ever hoped for. "You don't have to say anything, Eleanor," the Duke added softly, his eyes meeting hers. "I just needed to tell you that I'm trying, that I want to change, to be someone who is worthy of you." Her heart fluttered in her chest as she looked at him. She had spent so many nights alone in her thoughts, wondering if she was just a placeholder in his life, if she was just a woman to fill the emptiness. But now, in this moment, she saw something different. She saw a man who had been broken, who had lost everything, but who was willing to try, to fight for something new, something real. "You are already worthy," Eleanor finally said, her voice soft but full of sincerity. "You don't need to prove anything to me. I understand the pain you've carried. I've carried my own." The Duke's eyes softened, a flicker of emotion passing through them as he took a step closer to her. "I don't want to carry it anymore," he whispered. Eleanor reached out, her hand brushing against his. A simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. The air between them was charged with something new, something fragile, yet powerful. They stood there in silence for a long moment, their eyes locked, as if silently acknowledging the shift that had taken place between them. Eleanor had never believed that love could come from something like this, from a marriage born out of necessity, born out of duty. But standing here with the Duke, feeling the warmth of his hand in hers, she realized that perhaps love wasn't always something that appeared in grand gestures or passionate declarations. Sometimes, it was about being there for each other in the quiet moments, in the shared pain, in the slow, steady process of healing. "I want to try, too," Eleanor whispered, her heart full of hope. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to be with you, Duke. I want to see what we can build together." The Duke's eyes softened even more, and for the first time in a long while, he smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but one that held the promise of something more. "Then let's begin," he said, his voice steady with newfound resolve. And so, for the first time, it felt like they were no longer just two strangers bound by circumstance. They were two people, slowly, cautiously, learning to trust each other, learning to share in the quiet moments, and discovering that perhaps, just perhaps, love could bloom even in the most unexpected of places. In the weeks that followed, something began to shift at Ravenshill Manor. The air, once thick with the weight of unspoken words and unhealed wounds, had started to feel lighter, more open. Eleanor and the Duke, despite their unorthodox beginning, had found a rhythm together, one that was quiet and steady, but undeniable in its growing connection. Their mornings were spent in the library, Eleanor with her books, and the Duke with his letters, the silence between them now comfortable rather than tense. At night, they shared simple meals, talking about little things, nothing too serious, nothing too personal, but enough to create a bond that neither of them had expected. As the days passed, Eleanor began to notice changes in the Duke. His once cold exterior had begun to soften, his eyes losing the haunted look they had carried for so long. He smiled more often now, though it was still a rare sight, and he began to show a curiosity about her life, her thoughts, her dreams. There were still moments when he would retreat into himself, moments when the past would creep in like a shadow, but Eleanor had learned to give him space. She understood now that healing didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process, one step at a time. But there were also moments when he let his guard down completely, when the walls he had built around his heart crumbled, even if just for a brief moment. It was during one of these rare moments that the Duke asked her something that she never could have predicted. They were sitting together in the garden, the sun beginning to set behind the trees, casting a warm golden glow over the estate. Eleanor was watching a butterfly flutter by when the Duke, who had been quiet for some time, suddenly spoke. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and almost hesitant, "what would you say if I asked you to stay here, at Ravenshill, forever?" His words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected, and Eleanor turned to face him, her heart suddenly racing. She had not expected him to ask such a thing, not yet, not with the weight of their situation still so fresh. "Stay here, forever?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke looked at her then, his eyes full of something that she could not quite place. There was no anger, no impatience, only sincerity, something she hadn't seen in him before. "Yes," he said simply. "I know our circumstances are not ideal. I know this marriage was never meant to be anything more than a contract. But Eleanor, you have become something more to me." The words struck her like a thunderclap, and for a moment, she was speechless. The man who had once seemed so distant, so cold, was now standing before her, offering her something she had never imagined, his heart, his commitment, his future. But could she accept it? Could she really begin to believe in something so fragile, so new? "I never thought I would feel this way," the Duke continued, his gaze unwavering. "I never thought I would want anyone, let alone someone who was so far removed from my world. But you have shown me that there is more to life than just surviving. You have made me believe that I can live again, that we can build something together." Eleanor's heart swelled in her chest, her emotions so tangled that she didn't know how to respond. She had never expected this kind of love, had never imagined that the Duke, the grieving man who had been so closed off, would ever open his heart to her. And yet, here he was, standing before her, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't have to say anything," he said, taking a step closer to her, his hand reaching out as if to reassure her. "I just want you to know that, whatever happens, I am here. And if you can find it in your heart to stay, to build a life with me, I will do everything I can to make it a life worth living." His words were simple, yet they held so much weight, so much sincerity that Eleanor could feel her resolve beginning to crumble. She had come to Ravenshill with no expectations, with nothing but a sense of duty. But now, standing here with the Duke, she realized that there was something more, something that had grown between them, something worth holding on to. "I want to stay," she said, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. "I want to be with you, Duke. I want to see where this goes." The Duke's face softened, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. A genuine smile that reached his eyes and lit up his entire face. It was a smile that made Eleanor's heart flutter, and for the first time since arriving at Ravenshill, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. They were not perfect, neither of them, but they had found something in each other, something that neither of them had expected, and perhaps that was enough. "Then let's begin," he said, his voice steady, full of promise. "Let's start anew, Eleanor, together." And so, as the sun set behind them, the Duke and Eleanor began the next chapter of their lives, one filled with uncertainty, yes, but also with the promise of something beautiful, something they would build together. The days that followed were filled with a quiet anticipation, a sense of newness that lingered in the halls of Ravenshill Manor. Eleanor and the Duke, now bound not only by the contract of their marriage, but by something deeper, something unspoken, continued to grow closer, little by little. They had started to share more than just words. They shared glances, moments, small gestures that slowly began to bridge the gap that had once seemed insurmountable. It was not a love that had bloomed overnight, nor was it perfect, but it was something real, something they both felt, even if they didn't fully understand it. The Duke, whose life had been a solitary one, whose heart had been closed off for so long, was beginning to show a side of himself that he had hidden away for years. His cold exterior had melted, even if just slightly, and Eleanor found herself looking at him with a tenderness she hadn't known she was capable of. He was not the man he had been when they first met, the grieving, distant Duke, but a man who was slowly learning to trust again, to open himself to the possibility of something more. There were moments, however, when the past would return to haunt him, as it often did. Eleanor could see it in the way his gaze would drift, the way he would suddenly grow distant, as if a shadow from his past had slipped into the present. Those were the moments when Eleanor knew that healing, though begun, was still a long road ahead. One afternoon, as Eleanor walked through the garden, the weight of the manor's silence pressing in on her, she found herself wondering about the life she had come to lead here. She had never imagined this would be her future, not in her wildest dreams. She had come to Ravenshill with nothing, an orphan with no family to speak of, and now she was the Duchess of Ravenshill, a position that, on paper, seemed enviable. Yet, as she stood in the garden, surrounded by the lush greenery that had once seemed so foreign to her, she realized that it was not the title or the wealth that mattered. It was the quiet moments she had begun to share with the Duke, those small pieces of him that he had allowed her to see, that made her feel as though she was truly a part of this place, this life. As she walked, lost in thought, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw the Duke approaching, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, his expression thoughtful. There was a softness in his eyes now, a tenderness that hadn't been there before. "Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of something important. She turned to face him, her heart quickening in her chest. "Yes?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke stopped in front of her, his gaze locking onto hers, as though searching for the right words. "I've been thinking," he began, his words slow, deliberate, "about what we've been building here. About us." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. For the first time, she felt a surge of hope, a flutter of something more than just companionship, more than just obligation. The Duke continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know I've asked a lot of you, Eleanor," he said, "and I know that this marriage was never meant to be anything more than what it was. But I want you to know something. I want you to know that you are more to me than just a wife, more than just someone to fill the space beside me. You are someone I've come to care for, someone I've come to trust." His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, something he had never allowed anyone to see before. "And I don't know what the future holds," the Duke continued, taking a step closer to her. "But I want you to know that whatever happens, I am committed to you. To us." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't expected, one that took her completely by surprise. She had known, deep down, that the Duke had begun to change, that he was no longer the man who had closed himself off from the world. But to hear him say it, to hear him speak so openly, was more than she could have ever hoped for. "I'm committed to you, too," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I want to be here, with you, whatever comes." The Duke smiled then, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes and lit up his face. It was the kind of smile she had only seen a few times, but each time it made her heart flutter. In that moment, she knew that they had come a long way, that they had both fought for something that was worth having. And though the road ahead would still be uncertain, though there would still be challenges to face, she knew that they would face them together. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the garden, and as they stood there, side by side, Eleanor felt a sense of peace settle over her. Perhaps, just perhaps, this life they were building was exactly what they both needed. The days following their conversation were filled with a new kind of quiet intimacy between Eleanor and the Duke. They no longer felt like strangers bound by a contract, but two people finding their way together, slowly building something that neither had expected. There was still a sense of hesitation between them, but it was no longer the cold, unspoken distance that had once defined their relationship. Instead, it was a kind of tender uncertainty, an understanding that they were both still learning what it meant to truly be with each other. The Duke, once so closed off, was now showing more of himself than Eleanor had ever seen. He would sit with her in the evenings, talking about things other than duty, his childhood, his hopes, and even his fears. For the first time, he allowed her into the private world that had been locked away for so long. Eleanor, too, began to share more of herself, revealing pieces of her past she had kept hidden. She had always carried a certain level of shame about her upbringing, about the way she had been cast aside by society. But with the Duke, she felt no judgment. There was only understanding, and over time, a deep trust began to form between them. One afternoon, as Eleanor walked through the gardens, enjoying the quiet solitude that had become her escape, she was surprised to find the Duke waiting for her by the fountain. His usual calm demeanor seemed to have shifted, and there was a new intensity in his gaze. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low but filled with a certain urgency. She stopped in her tracks, unsure of what he was about to say. His eyes held something deeper than she had seen before, something that made her heart race with both excitement and fear. "I need to tell you something," he continued, stepping closer. "It's about my past, something I haven't shared with you yet. I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid. Afraid of what it might mean for us." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, and she nodded slowly, urging him to continue. She had known there was more to his story, more to the man he had become, but she hadn't pressed him. She had understood that he would share when he was ready. "Before I lost her," the Duke began, his voice catching slightly, "I was happy, Eleanor. I had a family, a future I thought was set. But everything changed the day she died. I never thought I would move on, that I would ever love again. I've spent so many years hiding from the possibility of it, hiding from the fear of losing someone else. But you've changed that for me. You've made me believe that it's possible to love again, to have a future again. And that terrifies me." Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat as she listened to him, her heart swelling with a mixture of sadness and hope. She had always known that his grief ran deep, but to hear him admit it so openly was a revelation. "I never wanted to burden you with this," he continued, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "But I cannot keep it from you anymore. I have fallen in love with you, Eleanor. I've loved you for some time now, and it's something I can no longer ignore, no longer deny." The world seemed to stop for a moment as Eleanor stood there, staring at him in disbelief. She had known that something had changed between them, had felt the growing connection, but to hear him say the words, to hear him finally admit it, was more than she had ever expected. She had thought that maybe, just maybe, love could grow between them, but never had she dared to believe it would happen so soon, so suddenly. "You've already changed my world," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I never thought I could love again either, but you've made me believe that it's possible, that there is more for both of us. The Duke stepped forward, his hand reaching out to gently lift her chin, his thumb brushing across her cheek. Then let's begin, he said softly. Let's start this new chapter together. We don't know what the future holds, but I am willing to face it with you, whatever it may be. Eleanor's heart swelled with a mixture of fear and excitement, but most of all, with a deep sense of peace. She had never expected this, never imagined that the man she had married out of necessity would become the man she would come to love. Yet, here he was, offering her a future they would build together, despite the odds. Together, she repeated, her voice steady now. She took his hand in hers, feeling the warmth of it, the strength of his grip. There was still uncertainty ahead, still challenges they would face, but in that moment, Eleanor knew one thing for sure. They had crossed a threshold, and whatever came next, they would face it side by side. Months passed, and the seasons changed at Ravenshill Manor, but the bond between Eleanor and the Duke only grew stronger. What had once been an arranged marriage, a union born out of necessity and circumstance, had blossomed into something deeper, something genuine. They had learned to navigate the complexities of their lives together, their once silent home now filled with laughter, quiet moments of intimacy, and an unspoken understanding that grew with each passing day. The Duke, who had been so consumed by grief and loss, now found solace in the presence of the woman he had never expected to love. Eleanor, too, had found peace. She had once feared that she was merely a replacement, a woman to fill the void left by the Duke's late wife. But now, she knew she was much more. She was his partner, his confidant, and, most surprisingly, his equal. Their relationship was not without its challenges, of course. The shadow of the past would occasionally creep in, as it always did, and the Duke's old wounds would surface, reminding them both of the pain they had each experienced. But they had learned to face these moments together, to acknowledge the past without letting it control their future. One evening, as the sun began to set over the vast estate, Eleanor stood by the window, looking out at the garden she had come to love. The flowers were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the dark days she had once known. She could hear the sound of footsteps behind her and turned to find the Duke approaching, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a hint of something more, something that made her heart race with anticipation. Eleanor, he said softly, his voice low but filled with emotion. She turned fully to face him, her heart skipping a beat at the intensity in his eyes. There is something I have been thinking about, he continued, taking a step closer to her. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had learned over the months that when the Duke spoke like this, it was never a small matter. What is it? She asked, her voice steady but her pulse quickening. The Duke paused for a moment, his gaze shifting to the ground before meeting hers once again. I want to give you everything, he said, his voice thick with sincerity. Not just my heart, not just my trust, but everything. I want you to have the choice to live your life, to follow your dreams, to be whoever you want to be. I want you to have the freedom to choose, just as I have chosen you. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears at his words. She had never thought of herself as someone deserving of such a life filled with choices, with freedom, with love. But here he was, offering it to her, asking nothing in return except for her to be herself. I never imagined this, she whispered, her voice trembling. I never thought I would be this happy, this free. But I am. With you. The Duke smiled, his eyes softening as he reached out to gently take her hand. Then let's make sure this is a life worth living, he said, his voice full of quiet determination. The next morning, after a peaceful night spent together, Eleanor woke to the sound of birds singing outside her window. She smiled to herself as she stretched, feeling more at home in Ravenshill than she had ever imagined possible. She knew that the life she had once feared was now the life she had chosen, one filled with love, with hope, and with the promise of a future that was no longer defined by the past. The Duke had kept his promise. He had given her the freedom she had longed for, and in return, she had given him her heart. Together, they had built something beautiful, something that had risen from the ashes of their pain, something that no longer belonged to the past, but to the future. As Eleanor joined the Duke in the garden later that morning, she knew that this was just the beginning of their story. They had come a long way, from two strangers bound by circumstance to two souls united by love. Whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as equals, as partners, and as a family. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor felt truly at home, not in a place, but in the heart of the man she had learned to love. Ravenshill Manor, once a place of shadows and sorrow, had become a home filled with light, filled with the promise of tomorrow.